I think we can probably start.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight to learn a little bit more about the historic district that's going on in the Gregory Tract neighborhood and about tax credits that you will be eligible for. We're going to start with some introductions just so that you get to know who here is part of the presentation. So Larry, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself first.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Francer. I'm the Associate Director of the Landmark Society of Western New York, and I'm your neighbor. I live on the corner of Nicholson and Wider, the big teal house. And I have been with the Landmark Society for about, it'll be, I believe, 9 years in September, and I've lived in the neighborhood for about 4 years.
Great. Caitlin?
I'm Caitlin Mivas. I'm the Director of Preservation with the Landmark Society, and that's all I'll say about myself.
And I'm Megan Clem. I'm the Preservation Planner at the Landmark Society.
And I'm Katie Como. I'm actually an alum of the Landmark Society. I worked there for quite a while, and now I'm at Barrow Architecture.
All right, so just to kind of give you a quick rundown on how this presentation will run tonight, we're going to give a little bit of a background on what the National Register of Historic Places is. Then we're going to get into a section with Katie where she'll talk specifically about the Gregory Tract Historic District that's going through the process right now of nomination. And then we'll end the presentation with some information on the New York State Homeowners Tax Credit Program, which you'll all be eligible for your residents with this listing. So to start out, I'm going to go ahead and let Larry give a little background on how this project came about.
Great. So as I said, I'm your neighbor, and that was why I wanted to get the neighborhood listed so that I could take advantage of tax credits with my husband on our home. That's the way it happens a lot. If a neighborhood doesn't come to us, Caitlin got the Park Avenue neighborhood listed where she lives, and that's how it all began. So we started working out originally about, I think it was 4 years ago, and SWPC was able to put in the application for us. We applied for funding through the Preservation League of New York State, and we didn't receive it. And then after that, we decided to apply for funding again through the Preservation League, but we also applied to the Rochester Area Community Foundation. And we did get the funding from the Community Foundation, but it wasn't enough without the additional funding from the Preservation League to do the entire nomination. So we hired Katie to start on the nomination, and she worked and got the statement of significance done, you know, sort of the history and why it was important. And then we had that under our belt, which really helped us, I think, when we reapplied to the Preservation League and we got funding that way. So that's pretty much it. We're doing it through Highland Park Neighbors Association, which I'm a member of, and I want to thank Roxanne Townsend, who's been working with us a great deal, and Stacy Bershad also has been working with us. Stacy, Roxanne, and her husband Kevin and I went out and we put flyers at all of your homes. So maybe that was how you heard about this, or maybe you saw it on social media, but we do want to thank you for being here, and stop by, my house if you have any questions, if you are in the neighborhood, and say hi. But of course, Megan and Caitlin are here at the Landmark Society to answer all of your questions as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Larry. So before we get into the main part of the presentation, I just want to give a quick overview of the who's who in the preservation world, especially as it comes to New York. So you have your government side and you have your nonprofit side. We at the Landmark Society are a local or regional nonprofit organization based out of Rochester. And we're actually fairly close to you, right in Highland Park at Warner Castle. Then we also have, as Larry mentioned, some funding that was that they had applied for through the Preservation League of New York. They're our statewide nonprofit preservation organization. And at the national level, you have the National Trust. And then on the government side, you have your village, your towns, your cities. This is not going to be a City of Rochester historic preservation district. So just be aware of that. It is not a city preservation district. At the state level, you have your State Historic Preservation Office, which is also the Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Division. They're also known as the SHPO. They're the ones who will be reviewing and approving and sending on your historic district to then the National Park Service at the federal level to have the final designation completed. So we'll start with a really quick run through of what is the National Register of Historic Places. And this was established by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It's the official list of historic buildings and sites, objects that are all recognized as significant in American history or under architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. The resources can be listed individually or as contributing to a historic district. In the case of Gregory Tract, we'll be talking about a historic district. So your properties will be listed as part of a district. This is an honorary designation, so it doesn't come with any restrictions to a private property owner unless you choose to use one of the state or federally funded programs that will be available to you. Other than that, there will be no restrictions to you on what you can do to your property.
Megan, can I jump in for just 1 second?
Sure.
And it probably works well with this slide. I know you mentioned a preservation district, a city preservation district, and that's something that I think is still confusing for people. Whenever we talk about getting a listing or listing our historic district, we're very specific with our terminology. And when you're working to get listed on the National Register of Historic Places, we refer to it as a historic district. And as Megan said, there are no restrictions. However, people often confuse it with a preservation district, a city preservation district, where you have to go in front of the preservation board to make major changes. So just once again, remember, this is a great thing, a historic district. Not that a preservation district isn't, but you don't have to worry about having any requirements or anything, asking permission to do things. We hate to say it, but I mean, you can do whatever you want to your home unless you're using state or federal funding, which of course the tax credits are part of that. And you can, in fact, tear down a home in a historic district. We hate saying that, and we hope nobody will, but there are no restrictions. Okay, I'll shut up.
Right. No, that was a really good point to make. So thank you, Larry. And just so that everyone knows, I forgot to mention this up front. We are going to have a question and answer session at the end, but if you think of something during the presentation, feel free to pop it right into the chat. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat feature. If you put that in there, Larry and Caitlin will be watching the chat. They may answer your questions during, or they will bring them up at the end during our question and answer. So please do make use of that. So now that you know that this is a historic district that you're having listed, What is a historic district? So it's a grouping of properties, in your case, residential neighborhood, but it can also be a commercial downtown or an industrial complex. And the district boundaries are determined by several factors, usually the history and the development of the neighborhood, as well as the integrity of the buildings that are within those proposed boundaries. And then last but not least, properties will be classified in the nomination as either contributing or non-contributing. Contributing means they are part of the historic district and contribute to that district and therefore eligible for the tax credits that you'll learn about later. Non-contributing would mean that you would not be eligible for tax credits. That typically is new construction or something that has been so significantly altered that you can't recognize it historically. So now I'm going to pass it over to Katie, and she's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the Gregory Tract Historic District.
All right, thanks, Megan. Thank you for including me in the presentation, and I also want to thank Gina DeBella, who I know is here tonight. She has been helping me with this, specifically with taking photographs and writing a lot of the building descriptions. Part of this nomination process is writing a description of every single building in the district, and there's over 500 of them. So that was a very big task, and Gina and I split that up, so thank you, Gina, for that. It may have been a surprise for many of you, maybe all of you, to find out that you lived in the Gregory Tract, because I know that's not a name that is really in use today. Although I think if you were to look at your deeds and look back to the original descriptions, you would still see that that phrase does come up. So the name of the district has to do with what Megan was just talking about in terms of how boundaries are created. And you can move to the next, Megan. People often think of landmarks or historic districts in kind of a George Washington slept here kind of a way, as a place where something extremely important happened, or where, you know, someone like George Washington lived. I think people often think that's the type of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about districts and landmarks. And it's true that when the whole process of the National Register was new, that was the first type of thing that was focused on, because, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of really notable buildings were being lost to things like urban renewal and highway construction. And so the first priority was to kind of designate those very significant things that people didn't want to see any more of them lost. But as time's gone on and as we've kind of broadened our thinking, we're trying to really recognize now a much broader range of kind of the experience of history and who lived places, and recognizing that it wasn't just kind of the captains of industry who were important in the city's growth. It was at least as much so, probably even more so, the people who were actually working in those industries, who, you know, they were the ones whose labor kind of powered the growth of Rochester. So we're trying to recognize neighborhoods like the Gregory Tract, where kind of more typical Rochesterians lived, and not just the mansions where people like George Eastman lived. But at the same time, we need to kind of identify areas that hold together in some way. So, for example, like in a village, like the village of Pittsford, the original district might have been, and in fact in Pittsford was, just kind of Main Street and State Street, and just the most, you know, central, most significant architecturally buildings. And now it's been broadened out to include almost the entire village. That's harder to do in a city neighborhood where there's not often a really distinct line from one neighborhood to the next, where current neighborhood names aren't usually what they were called historically, and there isn't always kind of a sharp delineation between one area and the next. So we have to come up with ways to come up with boundaries that are never going to be perfect. You know, any of the ones that I've done in the past that I look back on, I kind of look and say, oh, I wonder, you know, should we have added this block? Should we not? It's never possible to get it exactly perfect. So we do the best we can to identify an area that has some reason to be listed as a unit, and, you know, kind of look at different options and test that all out. So I'll show you how we did it for your neighborhood. And this is actually a sign in your neighborhood. I don't remember the address, but one of your neighbors has this on their house. On this site in 1897, nothing happened. So I just bring this up to point out that we're not talking about just places where some specific thing happened, but places that are important to the growth of Rochester more generally. So the next slide. One way that SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, likes to work on boundaries now is to look at the old plat maps and find something like a distinct tract or a subdivision. And so in this case, looking at the historic maps, we very quickly found this name Gregory Tract. This was from 1910, but all of the maps showed this in some form or another. So you can go to the next one. We did some research. I did some research on this and discovered that James H. Gregory was an attorney and a major landowner. He came to Rochester, I believe, around 1830 and bought a huge amount of land in the southeast part of the city of Rochester, or what was then the village of Rochester, I guess, or maybe it was the city at that point. He started subdividing his land into 1-acre lots. This is an ad from 1845 where he was trying to advertise his 1-acre lots in the south, a mile from the center of the city. He didn't have a lot of immediate success, if you go to the next one. And it was hard to tell on the old maps exactly what his property was. This is from 1851, so you see his name there, J. H. Gregory, on a pretty big area with some of the streets that you might recognize today. Nelson is Meg Street. You can see the Erie Canal in the upper right there. So there are a few houses here by 1851, not a whole lot, still mostly open farmland. So if you go next, we went to the county office building and found the original subdivision map that James Gregory filed when he wanted to subdivide part of his property. And it's a little difficult again to line this up with the current map, but you can do so. There are some things that haven't changed. So I've labeled some of the streets and landmarks like the canal that is now where 490 is. So this kind of became our starting point for what the largest possible boundaries of a Gregory Tract district might be. It could have been everything that he owned. So we started with that and then kind of chipped away at the edges, anything that really had been changed too much, or parking lots or things that just were too new and didn't quite fit in. But really the district is very much based on this original map. So you can go to the next. The Gregory Tract really started to take off when streetcars came into this part of Rochester. The first streetcar line in Rochester was in 1863 and ran along Lake Avenue. But just a few days later, the second streetcar line in the city started, and that went along Mount Hope Avenue to Mount Hope Cemetery. And that route was no coincidence because George Ellwanger and Patrick Barry were among the major organizers and financial backers of the streetcar company. And so they were very interested in helping people come to their nursery grounds, and then as they were starting to get into real estate development, even that early, but especially as time went on, more and more of their nursery grounds, they started turning into residential neighborhoods. So it was a huge benefit to them to have this transportation system going right along Mount Hope Avenue, making it very easy for people to live in their newly developing neighborhoods. And the same was true for the Gregory Tract. The streetcar line started running on South Avenue in 1874. There were lines on other major streets in the area as well over the next several years. And in the 1880s and 1890s, the lines were electrified. So at first they were drawn by horses, as in this photo, but they were electrified, which let the lines just expand all over the city and become a really significant major form of public transportation. Most of the early residents in the Gregory Tract neighborhood were German immigrants and their families. The churches in the neighborhood conducted services at least partly in German. Germans were the biggest ethnic group in Rochester, so this was pretty typical. And looking back at the census records, the people living here worked at optical companies, which in some cases was Kodak, but there was another optical company a little bit closer that a lot of them likely worked at. And then, very typical jobs in clothing factories, shoe companies, laborers of all kinds, people in the building trades. So very much the typical Rochesterians who were the workers in the factories and companies that made Rochester grow tremendously during this same period of time. So you can go to the next. So I'm going to show you some of the typical building types in the neighborhood, things that you see every day and maybe don't always notice the commonalities among them. So the simplest one is this one-story worker's cottage, which has a simple rectangular footprint, a gable roof, which is just that front-facing triangular roof, the way a little kid draws a house. And these were built, throughout kind of the post-Civil War period. And the reason I focus on form rather than style is because very often two buildings can be identical in just about every way that matters, with the exception of maybe some exterior detail. So as an example, I often show my house and the neighboring house, which were built in the 1920s, that are the same exact floor plan, same exact shape, everything about them is the same, except that mine has kind of classical looking porch supports, and my neighbor's has half timbering, so that's the vertical and diagonal wood lines that make theirs what we would call Tudor Revival, and mine we would call Colonial Revival, but they're really exactly the same house. So for that reason, I'm not dividing these up by style, but rather by form, because I think in a neighborhood like this, where houses were built by builders rather than designed by architects, you do see the same forms repeated over and over. And that's because builders kind of built what they knew and used traditional practices, often relied on pattern books, and weren't really trying to make high style, fancy examples, because these were meant to be affordable cottages for people working in the trades and in industries. So with these, you can see that there are some differences, like in the roof line. The one on the bottom row, the center, and the one on the right have kind of a lower pitched roof line. The ones in the rest of them have kind of a more steeply pitched roof line. And that can be kind of a clue to the age, but in this case, not necessarily. This was just a really common building form that persisted kind of throughout the second half of the 19th century. So if you can go to the next one. This next one is kind of an elaboration of that form, so still a rectangular footprint, still a front-facing gable roof, but these also have a cross gable, so that's a second gable roof going to the side. And in all of these cases, the entrance is kind of recessed so that the door is actually at the front of that side gable, and then that's kind of like a cutout from that front gabled form to give you a little bit of a porch sheltered under the main front gabled roof. So I think these are just really so adorable, and one of my favorite kind of building forms in the neighborhood. You can also have this similar kind of form with that side gable projecting out rather than kind of flush with the front of the front portion of the house. So it can have kind of an L-shaped footprint instead of this type. And again, you'll see kind of a variety of different types of details and things, but it's a very common form throughout this neighborhood. And we can go to the next one. This same kind of floor plan you'll also see in a 1.5 or a 2-story version. So once again, you've got a front-facing gable and then that side gabled wing. And this form just is, really ubiquitous in this neighborhood. And once again, you can see differences like the differences in the roof pitch. So on the lower row here, the first and the third, the one on the left and then the third one, have that lower pitch that probably indicates those are probably the oldest two within this group. But this same form, the builders just kept doing it over and over again as some of the details might change. So the yellow one in the bottom row has just a little bit more of an elaborate character to it with the cutaway corners on the first floor and a little bit of detail around the peak of the gable. Same for the one in the upper left that's got what we would call stick-style detailing. But if you ignore those kinds of details, this is the same house form over and over and over again, because that's what builders were familiar with and that's what they like to do for clients in this kind of price range. So if you can go to the next one. This house form, the 2-story front gabled house with the front porch, is just ubiquitous in Rochester because this is what builders were building kind of from the 1890s to about the 19 teens and 20s. So you will see this all over Rochester because the city was growing so fast in that time period that these were built everywhere. You'll see them in the 19th Ward, up in Maplewood, throughout the northeast quadrant, throughout the southeast. They're absolutely everywhere. We probably should have a name for them, like the Rochester front gabled house or something. Caitlin and I have talked about that a little bit as we've been driving around the city looking at these everywhere we go. So this again is something easy and familiar for builders to build, very convenient and affordable house for kind of people working throughout Rochester. So we can go to the next one. This is a kind of looks similar to the the previous in terms of being kind of a two-story boxy looking house, but this has even a much more boxy kind of character to it. This is a form that has a name. It's the American Foursquare. And this was referred to at the time as the most amount of house for the least amount of money. There were pattern books and also kits. You could order from a catalog. You could order a kit to make some of these types of houses. I don't know if any of these specifically were kit houses, but this is the type of thing you might have seen in the Sears catalog, where you could buy everything in the Sears catalog up to and including an entire, all the parts to make your house. So an American Foursquare is characterized by this very boxy kind of look. It's got a hipped roof, which is that pyramid roof form, usually a full width front porch. The one on the bottom right has a porch that doesn't go all the way across the front, and that can happen sometimes too. They often have dormers, which are the windows kind of poking up from the roof. And it's common for them to have different siding materials on the first and second floors. The one that's on the bottom row here both have that, where there's a clapboard siding on the first floor and then a shingle siding on the second floor. It's called what we would call a ribbon shingle siding, ribbon course shingle siding, where you've got alternating kind of taller and shorter appearing shingles there, so it gives it a very interesting texture. So you can go to the next one. Here's another house form called the bungalow, and these were really common in some cities, not as common in Rochester, but we do see them. Like the American Foursquare, this was common in the 1900 to 1930 time period, and they're characterized by a very broad side gabled roof, full width front porch that's kind of recessed under the main roof, and they often have that front dormer. And typically they're what we would call craftsman style, although bungalow, craftsman bungalow is sort of a style, bungalow is a form. They're said to be kind of based on at least the word bungalow comes from India, but they're not really very similar to any actual architecture in India. But certainly the idea of these very broad proportions with this broad front porch. These often were also sold as kits or from pattern books. So you can go to the next one. Most of the houses in the neighborhood were built as single-family houses, but there are quite a few that were built as doubles. And there's a couple common forms of doubles that you can see here. On the bottom row, the center and the right are a side-by-side kind of mirror image double, where there's two front doors and two windows, and they're kind of switched between the two, where the one in the middle has the two doors in the middle, and the one on the right has the doors on the outside, but same idea in both cases. And you can imagine that the two units next to each other are exactly the same, just kind of mirror images. And then another form that's very common in this neighborhood and adjoining neighborhoods are the ones that you see on the top row, where there's two front porches. One is kind of wrapping around the corner, and the other one is at the kind of opposite side of the front. And then in the bottom left is one that's on a corner lot, and so it's kind of got two fronts that are similar, each with its own front porch. So very sensitive ways to build double houses that are very compatible with an otherwise single-family neighborhood. You can go to the next one. There's not a lot of other uses besides houses in the neighborhood. It's mostly houses. There are a few churches, but there's also some commercial buildings. The two on the top are from the late 19th century, and the two on the bottom are from the early 20th century. And these you would typically find at trolley stops or streetcar stops. And they would have little neighborhood-oriented shops, like a butcher shop, a small grocery, a bakery. So the type of thing that you might want to stop in as you are getting off the trolley at the end of your day. And they would often also have residential spaces, so a shop owner might run the shop on the first floor and live on the second floor. You can go to the next one. When we are kind of describing and counting the buildings in the neighborhood, we do our best to also include all of the outbuildings to the extent that we can see them. We always stay on the sidewalk or in the street, so we can't always see everything. If buildings are way back behind, we have to kind of do our best. But these were all very easy to see from the street, so we ended up with good photos of some of these. Most of the houses in this neighborhood were built before cars were common. People in this neighborhood took the streetcar for the most part. But as cars became more prevalent in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s. People did add on garages, and here's some really nice examples of some different and distinctive ones. The one on the left, I met the owner who was out when I was out taking photos, and she told me that was used as a dairy. And both that one and the one above are built of a material called rock-faced concrete block, and this was made from a mold. So you could actually do it on your own property. You could buy a mold and pour the concrete in, and you'd have these blocks. That's why you see a repeated texture. And you often see this in foundations of houses. Like if you see American four squares in your neighborhood, look at the foundation, they're very often rock-faced concrete block. And so that would be used on garages because in the early days of cars, people thought they were just going to blow up all the time, and so you wanted to have a nice fireproof material for your garage. You can go to the next. So while the houses in this neighborhood were generally what we would call vernacular, meaning they were relatively, modest in character, they were built by builders rather than designed by architects, and often built from pattern books and things. But one really interesting aspect of the architecture of this time period is that there was this whole new technology where some building elements could be mechanized. So pieces that used to have to be carved by hand could now be done by machine. And that meant you could very quickly mass produce some very nice decorative elements. And a homeowner or a builder could just go to a catalog and pick out what they wanted, or they could go to the lumberyard and pick out what they wanted, and these things could be made quite inexpensively and like I said, mass produced. And that means that you see some of these repeated throughout the neighborhood. And in particular, the one in the upper left, that kind of sun or starburst or kind of flower design, that's a pierced ornament, so it's actually holes cut right into that piece there. And you see this in quite a few houses in the neighborhood. That's probably more common than the other two that you see in the top there, which also have pierced ornaments, so that kind of cut out fan kind of design in the center one, and then the right top is what we'd call a truss, a decorative truss in the gable peak there. Porches are also good places to look for some of these decorative elements, like these brackets in the first two photos there. And then the bottom right is that piece that goes along the slanted edge of the front gable is called a verge board, and the round piece there is a bullseye medallion. You see those on quite a few houses in the neighborhood, and there's also a lot of them that have this the striping there. That's actually incised, cut right into the verge board, and it's easy to see on this one because they've painted a different color, but in a lot of cases it's not painted like that, so you have to look a little carefully to see that, but you will see this detail on quite a few houses in the neighborhood as well. So I just point that out as a way to encourage you as you're walking around the neighborhood to maybe look around, look for some of these common decorative elements or common kind of repeated shapes that you can find in this neighborhood. It's that kind of thing that really make historic neighborhoods and neighborhoods in the city very special, because you don't find that everywhere you go, but your neighborhood is really full of these kind of wonderful little details. So with that, I will turn it back over to Megan.
Thank you, Katie, and I hope that you guys got a lot out of the kind of the significance and what makes your neighborhood so special. Part of why it's being listed to the National Register of Historic Places. So now that you know that your neighborhood is being listed to the National Register, we wanted to go over some of the benefits to you, the building owners, from this listing. As mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, this is an honorary designation. So again, there are no restrictions to you as a private property owner in any way. It also promotes heritage tourism and economic development. It raises awareness and in your community and pride in its history and knowledge of its history. And the most common thing, and what we'll be talking about now, are the historic tax credits. There are also other historic preservation grants and loan programs, generally for more commercial or not-for-profit organizations or government agencies. So not as many for your residential properties, but the historic tax credits are something that you can take advantage of. So the New York State Historic Homeowner Rehabilitation Tax Credit is a program that the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, administers. And the two names you see on the screen here, Christina Vagvolgi and Francis Stern, are the two people at SHPO who review applications for this area. So If you want to take a picture of this screen, or we can come back to it later, or you can email me later, I can get you the information. And that's who you can contact in order to get information about the tax credit and get your application rolling should you be interested. This is a tax credit, not a deduction. So that is something to remember. It's a tax credit. It's not a grant. It's not a deduction, and it's not a loan. It's a credit off of your personal New York State income taxes. And the credit is worth 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or we refer to them as QREs. This is not retroactive, so your work does have to be approved by SHPO before you start. Anything that is started before their approval is not able to be given tax credits. And you claim the tax credit when you file your New York State income tax return the following year after you've completed your project or projects, and it's been certified by the SHPO. And we'll get into this a little bit more later. So this is a quick little overview of how the tax credit program works. And we will go through each of these individually, so I won't read down this slide here. The first is qualification requirements. The number one thing to be able to use the homeowner historic tax credit is that it does have to be an owner occupied residence. So a rental property is not eligible for this program. It has to be a contributing structure in a National Register Historic District or individually listed. In your case, it will be the contributing structure in the historic district. And you do have to be located within a qualifying census tract, which Gregory Tract is. All of Rochester is within a qualifying census tract. It's important to remember that you do have to have a minimum of $5,000 in project expenditures or qualified rehabilitation expenses in order to be eligible for this program. So that just means that you can't submit your final, you can't claim your tax credit until you spent at least $5,000. And a minimum of 5% of your expenses does have to take place on the exterior of your building. The work does need to be approved by SHPO before it begins. And there's also a 2-year recapture period, which means if you've claimed the tax credit, you can't sell your house within 2 years, or the state can recapture the credit that they gave you. So this is just to avoid having things like people who flip houses come through and use this program when it's not actually their owner occupied residence. Oops. Okay, so now we'll get into some qualified rehabilitation expenses. This includes a lot of things you can see on the screen here, but roof repair, replacement, chimney repairs and restoration, anything that you can think of on your house. We like to say if you could grab a hold of your house and turn it upside down and shake it, what would stay in your house? And that typically would be a qualified rehabilitation expense to do repair work on. So that also includes window and door repairs or restoration, and in some instances, replacement. Painting of your interior, exterior of your home, redoing your kitchen and bathroom cabinets is an eligible expense. And something a lot of people don't realize is that your mechanical systems, such as HVAC, plumbing, and electrical, are all eligible. So that's, if you don't have HVAC and you want to install it, that's eligible. Or if you have the system already and you need to do an upgrade, that's an eligible expense as well. And then your soft cost things such as hiring an engineer or an architect to do drawings for you. And then people often think that historic preservation and sustainability don't go together. They do actually work hand in hand. So you can get tax credits for the installation of solar panels, with the caveat to just know that that's something that you do want to talk to your SHPO reviewer about. Generally, they don't approve solar panels on the front of a house, and they prefer them to be either on the back side of a home where they can't be seen or on a flat surface of a roof. So they are eligible. You just want to talk to them about where they can approve those to be done. Geothermal heating is an eligible expense, as well as furnace, boiler, or water heater upgrades or replacement. And then window efficiency upgrades, not necessarily replacement, but things like storm windows. And then also insulation. Now you have your unqualified rehabilitation expenses. So these are things that do not count towards the tax credit. Those are things like acquisition costs of the property. Outbuildings such as detached garages, barns, and sheds are unfortunately not eligible. They used to be, but are no longer. Hopefully someday that will change again. So those of you that do have detached garages, work to those would not be eligible for the tax credit. Generally, if for some reason you have a garage that is attached to your house, which is probably not common at all in this neighborhood, then work to your garage would be eligible. Other things such as site improvements, so that's driveways, sidewalks, landscaping, fencing, not eligible. New additions, so if you're going to put on a new addition, those typically can be approved through the tax credit program. They would have to be reviewed with your project, but the cost for them would not be an eligible expense. And that's often another common misconception about the tax credit program, is that they won't let you put an addition on your house, which is not true. You can. They generally recommend that that goes to the back of the house and not really visible from the front main side of the house. Other things like appliances and tools are not eligible. So those are things, for example, if you are going to do your own work to repair windows, if you're buying paintbrushes and scrapers, those are not eligible, but paint to repaint your windows would be eligible. Again, it's because the paint is staying with the house, the tools are not. And then if you are a DIYer, a do-it-yourself, your labor would not be eligible. So if you hire a contractor, the expense you incur for their labor is eligible for the tax credit, but your own labor is not. So when they're reviewing your tax credit application, the state looks at the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. This is a set of 10 guidelines that was set forth by the National Park Service, and it's what they use to review state and federally funded projects as a guide towards sensitive rehabilitation of historic buildings. So if you do apply for the tax credits, all the work to your property does have to comply with the standards, and that's something that the SHPO works with you on. Some general principles of these standards are that you retain the historic architectural features and materials of your home. That's what makes your house historic and significant to be listed in the first place. That you repair rather than replace materials, and when necessary, that you replace them in kind. So generally you're looking at wood for wood. Usually vinyl materials are not something that would be approved for the tax credit program. And then any alterations or additions, they don't take away from the historic home or the historic property, and that they be compatible with the building. So again, they would look at things like the design of your addition. These are all things as well, not to be scared off by the Secretary's standards. These are things that when SHPO is reviewing your project, they never come back with an additional denial right away if something doesn't comply. They work with you and try to help you bring your project into compliance so that you can get the tax credits. The second workflow item is assessing the existing conditions. So where do you start? Often when you are doing a project, there could be multiple things, and what do you do first? So to figure that out, you want to prioritize your work items. So what can wait and what can't wait? So things like structural stabilization, life safety issues, you want to always do first. Then you want to make sure that your building is weather tight. Water getting into your building is the enemy, and it will do more damage than what might be seen from the eye at first. And then design deficiencies that are causing ongoing damage. This could be the source of water damage to your property. So working with the SHPO and your architect or your contractor in order to come up with a solution to fix that design deficiency to make sure that your property is protected. And then active deterioration of materials and finishes. And then exterior envelope repairs. So you always want to make sure the exterior of your building is tight before you start working on some of the interior things that are more cosmetic. Then of course your mechanical systems and replacement of mechanical systems. And then any cosmetic improvements, you kind of want to put those to be the last work item that you do. If you're looking at, what are your financial needs, what can you do first? Those are things that you might want to do last. If you have a leaking roof, you don't necessarily want to fix your plaster walls on the interior first that have water damage. You want to fix where the water is coming in before you start working on the walls. Then you might be wondering, do I do the work myself or do I hire somebody? So your donated versus paid labor. Again, donated labor would not be an eligible expense for the tax credit because you're not incurring an expense, and that includes work that you do yourself. You're not actually incurring an expense for yourself. But paid labor, you're a contractor doing the work, is something that you can claim. And then, you know, people often ask, working on their historic homes, how do I know that my contractor or I are doing the work correctly, and where can I find resources to find the proper way or the best way to work on my historic house? There are resources for doing it right. The National Park Service, which is the federal level, again, we're at the beginning of the presentation when I showed you that, they came out with a bunch of, I think there's 40 some odd preservation briefs that they have on all different topics. The ones you can see here on the screen are repairs for thermal upgrading of historic steel windows, repointing mortar joints on historic masonry buildings. They have them for how to repaint your historic house properly. So you can, that's a really great place to start if you go to the National Park Service's website, or if you just Google preservation briefs, you'll be able to get to the website quickly. And you can probably find a preservation brief on whatever it is that you're looking to do. Some other resources are Old House Journal. And there are some books that have been written here locally. Rehab Rochester is a guide that's a little older now, but still has some great information in it for working on historic homes. And then one of our local friends, Steve Jordan, wrote the Window Sash Bible, which is great if you're looking to work on your historic windows yourself and repair them. That's a really great resource to use. And there's a lot of other ones too. So if you're looking to do something yourself, you can always reach out to myself or Caitlin or Larry, and we're happy to help point you in the right direction. So if you're looking to not do the work yourself, you want to hire somebody and you're not sure who to hire, you always want to make sure that you are hiring a contractor who has knowledge about historic properties and how to work on them. You can start by asking an architect. If you're working with an architect, they probably know a lot of contractors that have experience and are known for working on historic properties. And then if you're working with an architect, you want to make sure you're working with an architect who also knows historic buildings and has experience with rehabilitating historic buildings. Or you can call us the Landmark Society. Like I said, Larry, Caitlin, and I are happy to answer questions, point you in direction, give you some names of contractors that we know work in the field. And then you can also talk to your neighbors or friends or a family member who own a historic home themselves and have had work done. That's the best place to get recommendations and find out how contractors are. And just to note that qualified contractors to work on your historic home are often not the cheapest just because of the nature of the work. So they generally are not the contractors that can show up tomorrow to do work if you call them today. So now I'm going to quickly run through the actual application process itself, and I'll try to make this quick. You start with the Part 1 and Part 2 application, which you can see on your screen here. It's just general information about your property, the address, your owner information. If you're working with a consultant or you have somebody else helping you, like an architect, you can put them in as the project contact. And then you just go through, and it has a list under the section E over here on the left-hand side that makes sure that you have enclosed everything you're going to need for SHPO's review. Then the next page is this spreadsheet where you will put in all the information about the projects that you're doing. So you start with photo numbers. So you will have to submit photographs of the areas that you're doing work in the outside of your house. So you just put in the photo number that has to do with the work you're doing. So if I go to the next slide, you can kind of see an example of one that's been filled out. So in this case, photos 28 through 37 showed the windows, and they were working on storm windows, which needed to be, they were painted shut and had deterioration happening. And so they're removing the storm windows, scraping and repainting them and replacing the glass. And then you give an estimated cost. Now this doesn't have to be the final cost. SHPO is not looking for an exact number, but it's always helpful if you've talked to a contractor first to have a ballpark idea of what you're getting into. So again, photo numbers, just a brief description of what work you're going to be doing, and then you want to go over the existing conditions and then what you're going to be doing. So then you get the approval of your Part 2, and it'll come in the form of a letter signed by someone at the SHPO, just letting you know that your project has been approved and you can begin work. At that point, that's when you can start. You don't want to start any work before you get this letter or get notice from them that your project has been approved. If you're mid-work and you find that there's additional work that you need to do, or that there's a work item that you put in, you have to change how you're doing it, you submit an amendment sheet to the Part 2, which is what you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And that's much like the Part 2 application that we saw before. You're just going to put in what work is proposed, what the existing condition is, and what you're going to do. And if it's something where you're amending a work item that's already been approved, you just kind of explain why you have to amend it, why that work item needs to change. So then you get your approval from SHPO, you get all of your work done, and you have as long as you need to finish the work. So you do work until you hit that $5,000 minimum. So that doesn't have to be done in a year, and it doesn't have to be $5,000 on one project. So that's $5,000 total for all the projects you're doing as a minimum, and you can take multiple years to get to that point. Once you've hit that or gone beyond, you complete and document your work. So you want to make sure that you save your contractor's estimates. When you submit the Part 3 to the SHPO, they are not going to ask for your for this information, but you want to have it in case you're ever audited. So save your contractor's estimates, save your receipts. If you're doing work yourself, you do want to save receipts to document the expenditures for materials that you purchased. And remember again that your own labor and tools do not count towards the tax credits. You want to make sure you subtract those out of what you're claiming. And then save your final invoices for the completed work. And that includes professional fees if an architect or engineer is involved. Again, SHPO doesn't ask for these to review with your Part 3, but you will want to make sure you have them just in case you're ever audited. And it's just good to keep record for yourself. It's also always a good idea to take photos of the work in progress, and then also when it's completed. It's the completed photographs really that SHPO will need, but sometimes it's helpful to see what happened during the process. And then again, as mentioned before, you claim the tax credit on your taxes the following year after you've completed work. So if you did work this year and you had an approved application and you want to claim it on your 2021 taxes, you would want to make sure that you're submitting your Part 3 application to SHPO no later than November 1st. And the reason for that is it can take them up to 30 days to review the application, and you want to make sure that they've approved it before the end of the year so you can claim it on your taxes the following year. So then your Part 3 application. This is the final application that you submit. It shows all the work that you did that was approved and that it's been completed. You want to submit that by December 1st. Again, you want to submit it by December 1st because you want to make sure that SHPO has that month in order to review and approve your project. The earlier you get it in, the better. In case they have any questions, you won't be running up against the clock. And you want to include photographs of your completed work. This is what the Part 3 application looks like. Again, you'll just give a little bit of information on your property, so the address, and then everything that you've enclosed. Again, they give you a little checklist, so you make sure you're including everything that you need. And then you also just do a short description of the work you completed. So you can kind of take your Part 2 application and basically rewrite that here of what you actually did complete. And then you will also include your final cost on this page here. And then your final approval and taxes. So your Part 3 is approved. What do you do now? You want to claim the credit on your taxes. That's when you file your income taxes. This is one of those credits that you can add to it. Your credit can be carried forward until you use it. So this is an income liability. So if you don't have as much income tax liability as you owe that year, you can carry it forward multiple years until you've used it all. And a little side note is if you have a household gross income of $60,000 or less and you have unused credits from that year, the state will actually issue a refund check in that amount. Unfortunately, if you make more than that, it just doesn't work that way. It gets carried over each year until you've used it all. And also just be aware that the Landmark Society, we're not accountants or attorneys. So if you have specific financial or tax advice that you need, you do want to make sure you're consulting your tax accountant or your just accountant to get that information. SHPO staff also does not give financial or tax advice either. So you do want to make sure that you're talking to a financial tax person. This here is an example of the letter you'll get from SHPO once your Part 3 has been approved. This is what you submit along with the state's form to claim your historic homeownership rehabilitation tax credit. You submit these together with your income taxes, and that is how that moves forward through the state. If this all seems very confusing, which is okay, you can hire a consultant. You can hire the Landmark Society. So we do have an old house help program. We can come out and help you complete your tax credit application on your behalf. And then we also handle City of Rochester Preservation Board applications, which again, you guys don't need to worry about. You are not a preservation, you're not a city district. If you want to look up this old house help and find out more about what we can help you with as homeowners, you can visit landmarksociety.org/old house help. And there's a whole list of things that we can do on top of tax credits. We can come out and take a look at your house and help give you advice. We have a contractor list. So if you're looking for somebody, a painter, a mason, if you give us a little bit of information about what it is you're trying to do, we can try and give you specific contractors that do that type of work. So we are here to help you if you need that as well. So this is something that a homeowner, you can put together the application. It's very easy, but if it's something you just don't want to do, or it just seems a little overcomplicated for you, you can hire us to help you with that process. We also have, along with the tax credit program, the Esther Krakauer Scholarship Program. This is available to homeowners in National Register districts and City of Rochester districts within the city limits of Rochester. You do have to have a single income household of 50,000 or less, or a dual income household of 90,000 or less to qualify for this program. But what it does is if you apply to us for this, and you get applications through the rest of the Landmark Society, if you apply for that and you get the scholarship, that covers the cost of the Landmark Society doing the tax credit application for you. So we do have this program as well. So now we'll move into a question and answer session. Again, if you have questions after tonight, please feel free to email myself or Caitlin. Our email contact is on the screen right now. But please feel free to either put questions in the chat and we will answer those for you.
Great, thank you, Megan. We have one really good and important question in the chat so far. So if the work is done, if the tax credit work is done over multiple years, can you explain how that would work with claiming with the tax credit? How does that all work if you don't complete the project? You're doing several projects or one big project over multiple years. How does that work?
Sure. So it kind of how that works is you claim all of that work in 1 year on your tax credit. So let's say that right now you had an approved Part 2, so you can begin work tomorrow. And you are doing floor refinishing on the interior, you're painting the exterior of your house, and you're replacing your roof. But you either don't have the money to do it all right now, or you just aren't ready to move forward with all the work right away. You could do one of those projects now in 2021. You could then replace the roof in 2022, and you could paint your house in 2023. Then you would submit your Part 3. So basically, every time you've hit that $5,000 minimum mark, you can submit a Part 3 application and start a new Part 2 application. So if you go multiple years and you've got work from 2021 to 2023, and that's when you hit the 5,000 mark, then you would claim it on your 2023 taxes. You could submit all of it then together.
Great, thank you. How long, okay, another good question. How long does it take to get approval once you send in your Part 2 tax credit application?
Sure, once you send in that application, if you look at SHPO's website, they say that they have up to 30 days. What we've been noticing lately is they're usually turning around that approval within 2 to 3 weeks max. It really just depends on how many applications they get in at once, but we've been seeing it done in about 2 weeks recently.
And Megan, maybe I will add at this point that it probably does behoove you to put all the projects that you think you want to do on your application. Because as Megan said, you can take as long as you want. Each time you get to your 5,000, you can apply for the credits. And it just makes it a lot easier if you look at the entire house and what it needs and just get it all down there. It'll help you organize as well. So, you know, as Megan said, you prioritize, but if you know you're going to want to put on a roof and you're going to want to paint and you're going to want to put in an HVAC, a new HVAC, that's a lot of stuff and a lot of money, but get it all on the first application. Just get it done and get it done as you can.
Yeah, and that's just as an example. So I live in the Park Ave neighborhood where we have a historic district now, a recent one, and we're eligible for the homeowners tax credit program. So last summer, I submitted my Part 2 application, and I literally sat down and thought, what is every single little thing that I might want to do to this house over like the next 5 to 10 years? And I just put it all in the application, knowing that I only needed rough ballpark estimates. I didn't need actual estimates from contractors, knowing that I can amend my application if my plans change. And yes, like Larry said, the number of things I want to do add up quite quickly to well over $5,000. But I can, you know, do all of these projects as we have the money available. And if I want to claim the credits every time I hit that $5,000 threshold, I can. I haven't chosen to do that yet. I'm kind of waiting because the other requirement that Megan mentioned is 5% of your total project costs have to be on the exterior. So I don't want to claim my credits after I've done like my big exterior project in case there's interior work, so that I meet that 5% threshold. I have a couple of good questions in the chat that I want to be sure we get to. So going back to, if you've got, let's say, a house that's got 2 units in it and you're an owner occupant in one of those units, but you rent out the other one, can you take advantage of the homeowner tax credits?
Yes, you can. As long as you are the owner occupant, the occupant of one of those units, you can make use of the tax credit program.
And that's a good example where, you know, you definitely want to talk to your, you know, tax advisor, and things can get a little bit complicated. So let's say if you're doing, you've got 2 units, you're the owner, you live in one, and you want to replace the roof. If the owner's unit is 50% of the property, you can only claim credits on 50% of the cost of the roof. So it gets a little bit complicated, but yes, just know that yes, it is possible if you're an owner occupant in one unit. Okay, so we had someone ask, so how painting your house is covered, but not the garage. That's correct. And this was a determination that was made by the Department of Finance at the state level. Tax and Finance will only let things qualify on the main house. So anything outside of the main house, again, the landscaping, shed, garage, carriage barn, unfortunately, those are not eligible for tax credits.
Right. And I would say things like if you have a patio, that would not be eligible, but if you have a porch, work to your porch is eligible.
Any other questions? Feel free. We've got a few enough people. You can also unmute yourselves. Okay, we've got another one in the chat. If a paint job is done all at once, how do you break out the cost of outbuildings? That's a good question, Roxanne. I would probably have your painter break out, you know, itemize it if they can do that. You know, okay, it's going to cost $12,000 to paint the house and, you know, $2,000 to paint the garage, so that you can justify that, you know, in case you were ever audited, and you've got that documentation. Any other questions?
As Caitlin said, if you want to unmute yourself and ask at this point, that's just fine as well. And Megan, maybe we can stop sharing.
Yep.
And people will, they can, you know, turn their video on if they want to see their neighbors. And there we go.
There we go. Thank you.
Great. Yeah.
I couldn't get it to bring up my stop share.
And I see a thank you in there, and I want to thank Megan as well for doing a great presentation. Thank you, Katie. Your stuff was really, really interesting. I looked through it earlier today and someone said, well, if I've already been to one of these tax credit ones, you know, should I come to this? And I said, there's some really interesting material, some historical material. You'll really enjoy it. So thank you, Katie, as well.
We also, I'm going to put a link in the chat. We had someone ask, where do we go to get the application to start? So I'm going to paste the link. This is to the State Historic Preservation Office's website, SHPO's website. This will take you to their tax credit page. You want to scroll down to the homeowners section at the bottom, and then you'll see a link to a PDF of like an informational handout and the actual application forms. Question, I was late to the meeting and also would like my partner to see it. Will the video be available to rewatch? Yes, we are recording it. And by early next week, we'll get it up on our YouTube channel, and then we will email it out to anyone who is registered for tonight's webinar.
Great. I also want to thank Gina for her great work with Katie. I drove right by her down my street when she was working, and until I got to the end of the street and I was heading somewhere, that was Gina. I should have stopped and said hi. So anyway, thank you, Gina.
Yep, you're welcome.
Anything, Roxanne, do you want to say anything, or Stacy, you know, from the neighbors?
I don't have really anything to add at this point, except to thank everyone, Katie, Gina, all the Landmark Society folks. This is a great project for our neighborhood, and I so appreciate the effort that's been put in by all of you. And so, you know, I think it's a lot. I felt like it's a lot of information to digest. So I think it'll be nice to be able to have the recording and information online, and because it's a huge benefit to the folks in the Gregory Tract area. So thanks, everyone.
And
Yeah,
there will be another, the state requires a public meeting once the nomination gets scheduled to go before the state review board. So there will be another public meeting and SHPO staff. So Christina Bagbolgi, who manages the tax credit program, will most likely be on that at some point in the not too distant future.
Right. And to sort of follow up from what Roxanne said, it may feel a little overwhelming, but don't let it. Christina's wonderful. She just, you know, email her, give her a call. She'll really work with you. And, you know, we know a lot of people who do their own tax credit applications. So please don't feel overwhelmed. If you want us, you know, as I said, stop by my house. I can talk you down. That'll be fine. And, you know, if you really just don't have the time, don't want to deal with it, want the tax credit, call us and work with our old house help as well. Okay. Was there one last question there?
So there is a question. So if you are not in the Gregory Tract neighborhood and you're in the kind of wider Ellwanger, I should say larger, Ellwanger Berry, Highland Park neighborhood, HIPNA is working on raising funds to be able to get the paperwork done for those historic district nominations. HIPNA has a couple of grants out that they are waiting to hear back on, and they won't hear back on those until the end of the summer. So that the earliest that work, that research that Katie and Gina did in this case for this project, the earliest that would begin would be kind of the end of this summer, early fall. And usually the writing and research process takes about a year, give or take. So that's kind of the timeline you're looking at for those other neighborhoods around Highland Park. So that includes Azalea, Lilac, and kind of Ellingerberry Central there, Mulberry and Rockingham and streets around that.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to say something quick, that this was great tonight, and I learned so much about the housing stock in this end of the neighborhood. And it is, I mean, things that I never really knew before. So that was a fascinating part of this webinar too.
Great. Thanks, Stacy. Yeah. And thanks everybody for coming. So I think we're going to call it an evening and we can all get dinner. Okay. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.